going to talk about John Kerry.
Yeah. Speaking of no introspection.
That was good, actually.
Wow. Great transition, Shelley. Yeah.
All right. So John Kerry is the current special climate envoy to China, right? And the idea is that despite all the differences, that we have with China and the CCP, of course, the government doesn't usually call them CCP. Despite all the differences, at least there's this one thing we can work together on. And the problem is that in so many ways, the push to work with China on climate change, but it could be on anything, right? It prevents us, if we feel that we, the US government, need to work with China, are reliant on working with China on something really important, then it makes us back off from doing things that we should do to counter the Chinese Communist Party or to speak out against their abuses against their own people, like the Uyghurs and Falun Gong, or things that they're doing globally. And so having John Kerry, who's a very powerful and influential person in this position, is making it harder for the rest of the US government to stand up to China.
It doesn't necessarily have to be that way. And I've heard the argument that, we can still work together on climate and also still call out their genocide of the Uyghurs, for example, which I think is theoretically true. Like, you can still do that, and the U.S. government has done that, except for the fact that that's not how the CCP operates.
Right.
The CCP will want you to, because they constantly say this, right? Like, not just diplomatically, but also in the state-run media, in the propaganda. So they're always saying that, for us to really work with the U.S. has to really understand China, and they can't just pick and choose, and they have to accept us,
right. They basically they take it personally, mm-hmm. right? Like, for example, the U.S. and Canada have disputes over things, right? We even have territorial disputes in some islands, like off the coast of Maine, right? Like, there's a lot of disagreements, but the U.S. and Canada are basically both in the same category of rational government, where we can work together on things that are important. For example, piping oil from the Alberta tar sands into the U.S. quietly. But there's that cooperation. But the CCP operates in a way where it's like, if you have a disagreement about one thing, they take it so personally that they will punish you in totally other unrelated ways, right?
Well, it's
and
also
that's what makes it hard to work with
higher level than that. It's like the Chinese Communist Party considers itself at war with the United States. So its goal is not to find a way to work well with the United States.
The goal is to use climate change as a stick to beat the U.S. over the head with, and be like, okay, or to dangle a little carrot and be like, hey, you can, if you we'll work with you, but you have to give us concessions on other things.
Yeah, or design policies that handicap American business and industry, but allow China exceptions.
Right. I mean, when it comes to the core, there are several things that make economic growth possible in a country, right? And there are, legal things, having good legal system and having, free markets. But one of the really big important things for any country is low cost energy, right? And so the CCP is using climate change as a way to basically ensure that energy is cheaper in China than it is in the US, because they understand the economics of that. If energy is expensive, you don't want to put factories there. You don't want to do cutting edge AI research, because that's very energy intensive as well. So, energy costs are cheaper in China, and now manufacturing makes more sense in China. And it's a little more complex than that, because a lot of it's not direct. But this is a big thing that the CCP understands. And they've taken advantage of sort of greenwashing to do things like, criticize the US, and say, obviously you need solar panels, right? And they're making solar panels now in China using, in some cases, Uyghur slave labor.
Also, I think a lot of it was technology transfer from the US, right?
Right, stolen technology. And also some of those factories themselves are powered on a coal grid. So the idea like you're making solar panels, manufacturing them in a factory where the energy to power the factory comes from the highest carbon emitting source of energy. Well, coal's not the highest, but it's a high one, right? So like it's this total nonsense. And it's like the US is making this disconnect. Like the way to work with China on climate change is to get the CCP to make promises for the future, which
they will
stupid.
Definitely shut down their coal plants, except for the ones that they're currently building more of.
Right, and then two, being able to buy at a lower cost renewable energy hardware from China, like solar panels and wind turbines, and that. It's just idiotic, right? It's not going to work. If your goal is to reduce carbon emissions globally, it is not going to work to continue to use Chinese manufacturing. Like if we made all our solar panels and wind turbines in American factories, the cost would be a little more expensive, right? Because it's the power grid's more expensive here. But then you wouldn't have these dirty factories in your supply chain. You wouldn't have all this pollution happening, right? So
who thought about supply chains before 2020, really? Like, I don't think people thought about that. You know what I mean?
Right, and I think largely we as a nation are still thinking about supply chains in terms of how easy is it to get this, what can cause a disruption in the supply chain. But my point is that like at the core of China's manufacturing supply chain is environmentally destructive power sources.
Also slave labor.
And slave labor. But
not just the Uyghurs, also like
even if you don't
labor,
care about them putting ethnic minorities in concentration camps and whatever, right? You should there's people who care about that stuff, and there's people who care about carbon emissions, and so even if those aren't always the same groups, right? Like you don't just have to find the intersection of that Venn diagram. Like anyone from any of those groups should be like, hey, there's something we have to look at here. And you have to look at China's carbon emissions.
But they can kind of get away with it by claiming essentially that they are still a developing country and that it wasn't fair for developed countries like the US to be able to pollute for so many years and then get ahead technologically, right?
But
so they're like, we should be allowed to pollute now.
But that's totally illogical because like if you're concerned about carbon in the atmosphere causing global warming or climate change in general, then it shouldn't matter who's producing those carbon emissions. It's just the total net volume of carbon, right? So it doesn't make any logical sense to let some countries have a pass. Like if you're concerned about that, then the US's goal should be to get the countries that are the biggest carbon emitters to reduce their amount of carbon emissions no matter what.
But I think that what the CCP has done is essentially weaponized a different part of the climate change activism, which is that blaming the industrialized nations for exploiting these other third world countries.
In many
right?
cases, blaming capitalism.
Yeah, so it's like kind of the same thing where like Greta Thunberg at some point tweeted about like how the climate change is the fault of the global north for exploiting other countries. Like, so the global north is industrialized, like Western developed nations, right? And the global south is countries like Africa, South America, China considers themselves part of the global south.
Yes, we may be evil capitalists here, but we have less pollution per kilowatt hour produced.
No, what I'm saying is
than socialist countries.
That like what you're saying logically makes sense, but what the CCP is doing is weaponizing a different outrage involved in
like the evils of capitalism.
Well, or oppression, right? Like the idea that like China is a victim country because it is a developing third world country.
In reality, China is a victim country because everyone's victimized by the Chinese Communist Party.
But like the whole idea that like, oh, the CCP, for example, even the fact that there's so many Western developed nations like exporting their manufacturing to China, right? Because what you talked about with cheap energy, cheap labor, there's a way to spin that so that China is actually the victim here of these oppressive Western nations outsourcing their manufacturing. And we are actually the ones causing this like the carbon emissions in China because we're like through capitalism, right? Like trying to get the lowest price, et cetera. So I'm just saying that there is a way that they're logically able to play this game that kind of
Socialism,
absolves them of blame from the stuff that you're talking about.
socialism, communism, it's all about gaslighting.
So, I mean, and the reason we launched into this whole thing about, John Kerry and climate change is because, and I had failed to mention the reason, but there was a news item this week that is tied into that, which is the House Oversight Committee Chairman James Comer is demanding that John Kerry basically turn over any documents related to what Comer believes are secret negotiations with the Chinese regime, that could potentially undermine larger U.S. interests.
Is there proof that Kerry has been having secret negotiations?
Well, so that's the thing. Like, it's like Republicans want all the documents released, and surely there are documents, right? Like, yeah, but John Kerry's is in a cabinet level position, which
But he's
doesn't
not actually a member of the cabinet.
No,
right?
but it's at that level. He's reporting directly to the president, and that position does not require. It doesn't require the same type of oversight as a lot of other positions. There's no Senate approval like there would be for like a Supreme Court justice. So he's just kind of like this guy that's tagged on, and there's just no oversight really of what he's doing or how his budget is being spent. And so this could be just a Republican move to attack Kerry and attack Biden. It could also be born out of legitimate concern for what could possibly be in those exchanges.
Well, because there is a history of a lot of climate discussions being done outside of the view of the American public. Like that was a big criticism of the whole Paris Climate Agreement, that it was a decision sort of done by these global leaders, and it affected American industry.
But it didn't have to be essentially put to a vote in a way because it didn't go through Congress.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So there is precedent for the idea that there would be these outside channels doing things, making agreements behind the scenes that the American public is unaware of.
I think there is some evidence that the Biden administration themselves have been upset with John Kerry or members of the Biden administration, because when Kerry was doing climate negotiations with China, like I don't remember if it was last year or 2021, there was a bunch of leaks that happened that were reported in the media about how there was frustration with Kerry, like wanting to downplay certain like human rights things so they could get action on climate change or whatever. And this is all leaks coming from within the Biden administration.
Interesting.
So I think that there was a certain amount of tension between people with different agendas, right? Like people who felt like Kerry and his climate change agenda was undermining other parts of the China policy that they were trying to carry out.